Mill is the main reference for what we call teleological ethics. In other words, ethics where you're concerned primarily with the outcome and not with so much with the philosophy behind the rule or the rule itself. And deontological ethics, which was Kant, is rule-based. And so almost all religions are rule-based. They're not looking for the outcome. They say, God says this, and this is what you do. They're not, Jesus didn't try to reform the welfare system in Rome. He uh, he just spoke about what he thought were and we talked about that his ethics were eschatological. In other words, you're not concerned uh, with day by day stuff and this earth, you're concerned with eternity. And so you should comport yourselves as though you may die tomorrow, but what you do today is going to be in it's going to be consistent with God's will. That that's a religious kind of teaching, and that's all deontological. And so Kant's main criticism of the guy we're going to talk to today, or talk about today, actually, it wasn't a criticism of him because he was the next century. Kant was in the 18th century and Mill was in the 19th century. So he wasn't criticizing Mill specifically. However, primary criticism of Kant against teleological ethics was that in order to really perform well in teleological ethics, you had to be able to see the future. You had to be able to be omniscient and know what the results of your rules would be. If you're trying to achieve this, well, we know this in any kind of legislation, there are unintended consequences, right? So this could be true of any ethical act unless you're omniscient and you can see exactly or any ethical act that's intended to have a result uh, can go sideways on you. And so Kant didn't think we could rely with our rationality on uh, teleological ethics. And then on the other hand, Mill falls into that category of British empiricists, and he thought the primary thing was the outcome and what result do you intend to see? And I think we mentioned that Hume is sometimes thought of as the first empiricist, excuse me, the first utilitarian, because he said uh, he based his ethics on just what he saw people do, as opposed to trying to rely on metaphysics or uh, religion. Do you remember what Hume's guillotine is? Hume's guillotine was the idea that you can't base ethics on facts. Uh, is does not imply ought. It's called the is ought problem. And because the way the earth or the because our lives are a certain way doesn't imply anything about what they ought to be. And there's poetry along those lines. But anyway, so Hume's guillotine um, would um, also be critical of Mill because if you are trying to like say Mill's rule that we're going to get to is what you try to achieve is the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Suppose you achieved it, you still couldn't say that it was right. If you got everybody to be satisfied with the way things are, maybe they're satisfied because they've enslaved a bunch of people. And so the majority, the greatest number, in other words, the majority could be quite satisfied with the enslavement of the minority. So it doesn't necessarily follow that if you've achieved the greatest happiness for the greatest number, you've achieved something that is ethical. All right. So, um, anyway, so John Stuart Mill, mid 19th century kind of guy, and British, and he is Among other things, he's the first guy who actually advocates for women's rights. I'll just let that go. Advocates for women's rights. See, this is a new thing. He's the first guy I know of since Plato. Plato, if you remember, thought women were just as capable of uh, intellectual development and being the guardians. He was willing to say, yeah, women could be just as good at running the government as men could be, which was in his day quite a radical thing. And I don't remember between Plato and Mill anybody making that argument. Another thing you may remember about John Stuart Mill is that now he's not known for his metaphysics like Hume or Kant or Plato, but he's mostly known as a political or ethical kind of thinker. But anyway, you may remember that you remember the problem of evil, which is that if God is omniscient, omnipotent, and beneficent, how could evil exist? And Mill says what you do is you throw out the omnipotent part and you say God needs your help. And that's why, that's how you solve the problem of evil, that the world isn't perfect. And in order for it to be more perfect, you have to do uh, something to help God. So that was a Mill, that's another famous argument by Mill. So the greatest happiness for the greatest number is his principle. The other big utilitarian is Jeremy Bentham, and there Jeremy Bentham had a hedonic calculus, which is you just you you figure out how intense. He has a list. I think there's eight things. I could look it up, but I don't have it written down right now. It's like intensity, duration of the pleasure. If you're trying to seek pleasure or happiness, you have these variables. One is the intensity of the pleasure, another is the uh, length, the duration of it, another is the certainty of it. Like, for example, you uh, probably will take pleasure in getting a college education. How certain are you that you can make it through college? Is there a gamble involved in it? Is it fertile? In other words, does it will it give birth to other pleasures? Um, are there negatives? In other words, getting drunk is pretty good, but how about the hangover? So how I think he calls that purity. Uh, and the effect on other people is also important. Mill's going to say that if you're happy, you're going to be have a good effect on other people. If you've sought pleasure in the right way, you're going to be uh, influential and beneficial. Your presence is going to be beneficial in the world. It's going to be part of achieving the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Okay, now what we want to ask ourselves is to what extent Mill really manages to be an empiricist. And one of the things he argues with or argues about with his women's, by the way, the women's, let me get the title correctly for you. I don't want to give you the wrong title. His,
The subjection of women.
oh, you knew, 1869, The Subjection of Women, which he supposedly co-wrote with his wife.
Hmm.
Uh, and he gives Harriet Taylor is her name, and he gives her plenty of credit for that. People are saying, like they know about this work. You guys familiar with it?
Yes, I am. I've read it. Hmm.
And what'd you think?
I thought it was really interesting, but it was a long time ago.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, it's a
I'm,
really
I'm-
important work. And it was a really important marital relationship too, because of all the respect that they had for each other, intellectual respect.
yes, absolutely. Well, one of the things, an interesting thing about his, I actually wasn't going to start with that, but since we're talking about it, one of the interesting arguments he makes in favor of the equality of women is that it will be beneficial. In other words, he argues from a teleological. He doesn't say like Kant would say. Kant Kant's idea of the categorical imperative is that every individual should be treated the same. Uh, and that is a deontological principle. But Mill doesn't argue from that point of view. He says that here's a quote from it, the legal subordination of one sex to the other is wrong in itself. Now he says that, and now one of the chief hindrances to human improvement. And so what he was saying was that denying women equal opportunities stifled their development, wasted potential, and therefore harmed society as a whole. Um, and he was highly critical of Victorian marriage laws, in which the husband was the wife's legal master, and all she has belongs to him. And so he advocated for legal equality in marriage, the right for women to work and to own property, and for education for girls. He criticized the argument that women are naturally inferior, which was a traditional view from, Aristotle on, pointing out that you can't claim to know what women are capable of while at the same time preventing them from trying, which is a pretty good argument. The opinion which this is a quote, the opinion which men entertain of the intellectual inferiority of women is the result of an education which systematically confines them to inferior pursuits. So we're going to give old John Stuart Mill credit for being one of the pioneers in intellectually defending the equality of women. Yeah, Peter, I'm
Mill
sorry.
was a pioneer, but of course, Mary Wollstonecraft came earlier and had many of the same ideas, particularly about the wasted potential of women who are brought up to be dolls. And, being a woman, she could also say, if women want to have political responsibility, they better shape up and act as if they're capable of it.
Oh,
Bill, as a man, chivalry alone would keep him from emphasizing that, but she did. So she's important too. She wasn't very widely read comparatively.
well, Mill was, yeah, kind of a public figure, and
Well, she was too, but she was also kind of marginalized, not only because she was a woman, because she was a radical,
yeah, Mill
you
wasn't a
know.
radical, although his emphasis on teleological ethics is a bit different from the churches. Let's put it that way. The Christians try to make the point. They would argue that if everybody was a Christian, people would be happier. That would be the Christian argument, and so the result would be what Mill's trying to achieve. Mill doesn't say that. However, he does. This is a funny thing. Jesus taught the golden rule. So did Hobbes. So did Mill, and so did Kant. All four of those people taught it from a different perspective. And this is why I like metaphysics. In other words, considering the arguments and the structure of the world you're considering as at least fundamental to your ethics. If you have a different concept of what the world is like, then uh, your ethics, you could say the same words and they'll mean something completely different. Let's put it that way. Anyway, so Mill Mill made some weird, let's see if I have them here in my notes. Mill made some weird arguments, though, that I don't know, they just stick out like a sore thumb to me, and I can't get over them. Um, Listen to this passage here. The only proof capable of being given that an object, this reminds me of Ayn Rand, by the way, not the same kind of thinker at all. Anyway, this is the quote. The only proof capable of being given that an object is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it. And so of the other sources of our experience. In like manner, I apprehend, the sole evidence it is possible to produce, that anything is desirable, is that people do actually desire it. What do you think of that argument? Nobody thinks anything of it. Does it make sense to you?
People desire different things. So from the beginning, a universalist ethic is going to crash against that if you make that the main point.
Well, I think there's a worse problem with the argument. That's what you say is certainly true, but there's a worse problem. It's equivocation. If I say something is visible, I mean it can be seen. If I say something is desirable, it means it ought to be desired. That's a completely different thing. He's it's a
Yeah.
terrible argument. I couldn't believe it the first time I read it. I went, has this guy graduated high school? I mean,
Mhm.
that is an awful argument, and the fallacy is equivocation. He's using the word the suffix able, desirable, visible, in two ways that are not the same at all. And it's a sleight of hand. It's kind of embarrassing. I don't know why. I guess I'm raking him over the coals here, but uh, it was just so shocking to me that I can't fail to bring it up.
But
Anyway,
I'm sorry, John, a bit. Isn't that kind of sort of Hume's idea? Well, I look around the world, everybody wants to do this, so that must be right. Um, from an ethical standpoint, isn't that
well,
kind of the same thing? We say people are desiring, so that's desirable. And I agree with you that desirable is let's say, called a standard rather than, or a judgment level rather than experience.
yeah, but Hume wasn't making this specific argument. I'm just pointing out the structure of that argument itself. Hume said that in a way, what you're saying is that Hume is basing that these guys were all trying to avoid making any metaphysical statements. That's why I pointed out the thing about equality. It's not a deontological point. He's saying that equality is going to be better for society, and the equality of women is going to be better for society because people who are stifled in their creativity and their output will now be admitted and therefore will have a greater pool of energetic, creative people. That's the idea. But the argument of Kant that you can only act according to that maxim by which that you could will to be universal. That's not what uh, Mill is saying. I'm just trying to make the distinction between the two ways of approaching the problem. Uh, Mill, I don't think is quite saying the same thing in this argument. But anyway, it's a terrible argument. I just, for some reason, perversely wanted to make fun of Mill for using it. All right, so what Mill does, he's famous. This is another thing I just wanted to go over. But before I get to that, when we uh, judge pleasures, remember Bentham's hedonic calculus. When we judge the pleasures, Bentham wants to quantify everything, and like put a value on the intensity and put a value on the duration kind of thing. I think Bentham is actually just kind of describing the way we make decisions rather than, I don't know if anybody doesn't do that. I'm not sure recommending that. Am I going to get drunk tonight? Well, I'm going to consider, is it certain I'm going to get drunk? In other words, is it pretty guaranteed? Yeah, if I drink, it's very unlikely I won't get drunk. Uh, will it have, will it be fertile? Will it benefit? Will it lead to other pleasures? Well, maybe, but also it could. Anyway, he wanted to ask questions in that way, but Mill brings something again questionable into the argument, which is the quality of the pleasures. And one of his famous quotes is, "It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. That's a famous quote from Mill. And uh, here's what he says about the difference between intellectual, which he calls one of the higher pleasures. Uh, he says, and physical pleasures. Of the two pleasures, if there be one which all or almost all who have experience of both give a decided preference, that is the more desirable pleasure. He seems to think that you can poll everybody that's had experience of higher pleasures like reading Shakespeare and those who have just eaten burgers, and if you poll them, you'll find out that the ones that have had experiences of both will uh, prefer Shakespeare. I just completely deny this. If you go to the faculty of Harvard University, the philosophy faculty, and you ask them whether they'd like to spend the day starving but reading Shakespeare or having a burger with friends, I don't think many of them are going to say that they'd prefer the Shakespeare. I just don't think that. I've known some professors at some pretty highfalutin universities, and they're like human beings. They don't like deprive themselves of all the normal pleasures of life. And another thing about this argument is that I think we inherit it from really Plato and Aristotle, but there are plenty of pleasures and Epicurus. I think I mentioned this when we were talking about Epicurus. There are plenty of pleasures that do not involve like sex or eating. You might enjoy fishing. Bill Juice isn't here today, but he likes to go fishing. You might like to dance. You might like to play music. There's all kinds of pleasures that you really wouldn't call carnal pleasures, but there nevertheless can be very intense. And again, I would say, suppose one of your professors at Harvard there is a wonderful violinist and he loves playing music. Is he going to say that he'd rather be reading than playing his violin? I don't think that's an easy judgment to make, but Mill thinks it's obvious. Somebody have their hand up? No. Uh, what, am I off the rails here, or what does anybody think about this?
I agree with you, but I also think that Mill's peculiarly rigorous education gave him a tendency to separate intellectual pleasures from other pleasures that most people don't have, and that in the autobiography he recognizes was not actually good for him.
Yeah, I personally have a hard time even uh, separating the pleasures. Like you could be eating a meal and thinking about Shakespeare at the same time, and you can analyze like you can have a physical pleasure and you could be analyzing it with your brain to death. You could be thinking about it. I don't think your brain just doesn't function while you're skiing. That seems weird to me that you could just separate those two and say one's better than the other. Never you never do that, I don't think. It just seems like a weird but very common. It seems like a weird but very common kind of separation to me.
My
That
brain did not function while I was skiing, which is why I'll never ski again.
No. Well, I'm not saying it always would. Sometimes you're just in the flow, like playing music. I played music forever, and you're just completely locked into that experience. But you could be thinking, I could think and play drums at the same time, and I think you could do that with skiing. Or you could be analytic about your skiing. That's what I'm saying. It doesn't have to be you're thinking about Hume when you're skiing. You could be thinking about the edge on your skis while you're skiing. But you could be analyzing it. I just don't think the brain stops to analyze things when well, mine doesn't. Uh, and I doubt if yours does too. Does either, I guess I should say. Okay, I have another thing to say about Mill. Now, Mill said that I mentioned this before, but Mill is going to say that you uh both he and Kant say if you don't have any instinct to be moral, then I can't help you. And but he does say, Kant doesn't say this to my knowledge, that he says if you're one of those people that doesn't have an instinct to be moral, then you have to have external sanctions rather than internal sanctions. Most of us, Mill thinks, will respond to ethical arguments and ethical ideas because we want to do the right thing. We desire to be good. And however, he says there are those people who don't care if they're good, I guess. And so for those people, external sanctions, in other words, the law, that's what the law is for. Uh, I'm not sure what I think of that argument, but that's what he says. Let me see. I think, do I have it here? Uh, On them, morality of any kind has no hold but through external sanctions. Of the other kind of person, the one who has feelings that make the internal sanction operative, it is unnecessary to speak. To him, morality, which is grounded on that sanction, is not only capable of being known, but is known. I'm not so sure that I buy that because I think people, well, this is the whole problem. The reason I like philosophical arguments and analysis is because I'm sure the people that support Trump, or no, I'm not sure. Some people who support Trump believe they're doing the right thing. They believe in their hearts they're really doing the right thing. They believe that. And so I'm not sure you can uh, get them to want to do the right thing in a different way if they already believe they're doing the right thing. I don't know, that wasn't that clear, but uh, Mill seems to think it'll be obvious once you have the instinct to do the right thing, it'll be obvious uh, that you should follow some kind of moral rule like the ones he's proposing. And I don't think that gets us very far. Uh, Probably the people who follow Trump also believe that following him will result in the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Let's see. Doug says recently saw MAGA. Oops, he disappeared.
Yeah.
Uh, no, he didn't disappear. I just didn't have. Recently saw MAGA characterized as the dumbest motherfuckers on the planet. Well, that's a little bit beneath the dignity of John Stuart Mill, but I'm down for it. Let's see. Douglas has another comment. Lady Sackville West was asked if she thought another woman had married beneath her station. She replied that every woman has married beneath her station. I can't disagree with that. Blake said if a fool would persist in his folly, he would become wise. Uh, that reminds me of, I've never been able to find this quote, but um, I thought it was um, Luther who said that if you want to become a Christian, go out and sin and sin and sin. The idea being that you'd you'd become horribly depressed and you wouldn't be happy if you did that. I'm not so sure that's a good rule, but I can't find it anyway. I'm going to search for it again. I haven't been able to find it excuse me, yeah, that Luther said this. Okay. One more thing or a couple more things about Mill are that we do practice utilitarianism in our legislature. And I mentioned this before. In the law courts, we try to follow the categorical imperative that every person is treated the same. And another version of that rule from Kant is that every person should be treated as an end and not a means. Uh, and I think that would apply to women's rights as well, that women, that all people should be treated as an end. And I extend this to all individuals should be treated as an end and never a class of people treated as an end. But in our legislature, we use negative utilitarianism. And I think I mentioned this before. Instead of trying to pass laws that achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number, what we try to do is avoid the greatest trouble for the greatest number, the greatest suffering for the greatest number. Like the best the government can do to prevent disease, prevent war, prevent civil disturbance. Those are the things the government tries to do, not promote the greatest happiness, because the greatest happiness now, Mill wrote another book called On Liberty, which is uh, essentially the rule in that book is that the government has no business interfering with anything you do unless you're causing harm. Everything else you should be free to do. And the legislature, therefore, I'm not sure that I can make that consistent with his greatest happiness for the greatest number, because the legislature shouldn't pass a law unless it inhibits you from doing creating harm. But then should it pass laws that makes you happy? Well, I guess it shouldn't if you're going to go by the rule of on liberty. I'm not sure how it can pass a law that will make you happy. All it can do is pass a law that will be likely to decrease your chances of unhappiness, I think. Uh, oh, okay. Doug found he did an AI quote you mentioned is often paraphrased or misattributed to Martin Luther, the German theologian, blah, blah, blah. However, there's no direct evidence. Yeah, that's uh, no direct evidence. Right, that's what I found. But I don't know where I guess I just found it from some rumor, but it's a great quote. If you want to become a Christian, just go out and sin and sin and sin. One other thing I want to say about Mill is that he was the first guy I know that supported animal rights. And he doesn't consider animals equal to human beings, but he thinks they're sentient, and he thinks you should avoid doing anything that causes them suffering. Mill is the first guy I know that speaks about this. He probably isn't the first guy. Peter's going to come up with somebody previous, probably, but I don't know of anybody previously to Mill that supported a uh, a life that avoids any kind of cruelty to animals. He wasn't a vegetarian though. He didn't go as far as the Pythagoreans and become vegetarian, or the Jains, but he did support. Uh, I'm not sure to what extent he supported legislation that would prohibit you from, but he thought it was a good idea that animals also should be considered with his program of greatest happiness for the greatest number. Now, philosophers love to think about, you've heard of the trolley problem? It's very, very famous problem. The trolley problem is you're on a trolley car and there's a switch coming up, and if you don't throw the switch, you're going to go down a track that kills, let's say, 10 people. They're sitting on the track or something. And if you do throw the switch, you're going to go down a track that kills only one person. This is one of the many versions of thought experiments that puts the feet of utilitarianism to the fire. So what should you do? Because if you don't throw the switch, you don't do anything, you're going to kill 10 people. But if you do throw the switch, then you've taken an action that's going to kill that one person. In the first situation, you could call yourself a victim, that you just didn't have any, you didn't take any action and somebody died. It was like an accident. Whereas on the other choice, you took an action that resulted in somebody's uh, death. So what do we do? That's the trolley problem, and a problem that is a similar thought experiment directed towards Kant's categorical imperative is a philosopher uh, thought up something called the town of Eklum. And in Eklum, everybody is treated exactly the same. You treat everybody exactly the same. Well, suppose there's a terrible fire in the town and you hear about it and you're at work and you rush back to the town. The problem posed is do you treat everybody equally? You just go to the random first house you get to and try to rescue people, or do you go to your house where your family is? Which one do you go to? And this is called the proximity problem, and we can extend it to if somebody's dying in Oakland, is it less important that somebody is dying in Zaire? It's and we tend to care more about the people that are closest to us. That's the proximity problem. And there aren't any, I'd like to tell you there are solutions to these problems, but what they do, they don't give us solutions. What they do is uh, demonstrate the inadequacies of all the rules that we have. That and then some people at that point they just say, well, it's situational. You just do what the best thing you can do at the time is, and that's not a good answer. That's not a good answer either. So those are kind of the three typical ethical schools of ethical thought, aside from religion. In the 20th century, philosophers started to argue that ethical terms were just recommendations. They didn't have any basis in any kind of metaphysics or reality. They were just things that you recommended. And it's hard to argue with that. Kant and then Nietzsche are going to say that most ethical judgments that you make about other people are just your own personal opinion that you've clothed with a bunch of important sounding language. Uh, this is what Nietzsche says. And you can get all self-righteous about something that uh, you would never want to do in the first place. And so you're never tempted to do it, but some other person does it, and you think it's just a terrible thing, but it's not something you would have done anyway. Barry, you wanted to say something?
I mean, my comment was actually relates to what you just said. If you said earlier that there are some people who just want to do good, just for some reason they already have an ethical code that they're operating under, and some people don't. So it seems to me if that's true, which I think it probably is, it makes sense to use laws to prohibit negative behaviors because those are the only, because those respond to the people who don't have a natural ethical code that they bring with them, so you're basically trying to prevent some things that you can prevent because you don't have to worry about the people who naturally want to do good.
That's actually what Mill says, what you just said. That if there are for the people in society that don't have an internal sanction against doing bad things, you need external sanctions, which are laws. That's exactly what that says. Let me see here. Something just flashed through my mind, as things will. Oh, Mill's methods. We haven't covered that yet, right? So Mill's methods are Laurel's not here today. She had a more sophisticated version of this, but these are the methods used for inductive reasoning. In other words, determining the difference between correlation and cause, right? So I'm just going to go through these. There's four of them, or excuse me, five of them, and they're very well known, but I'll just go through them anyway. First, we have the method of agreement. If two or more cases of a phenomenon share one common factor, that factor is likely the cause. Um, and, and the example is everyone who got food poisoning ate the potato salad. Then there is the method of difference. If two situations are identical except for one factor and only one factor, only one produces the effect, then that differing factor is the cause. And the example for this is two diners ate the same meal, but only one had the potato salad, and only that one got sick. And then number three is the joint method of agreement and difference. It combines the first two, looks for a common factor present when the effect occurs and absent when it does not. Okay, people who ate the salad got sick, people who didn't. Method of residues. Subtract known effects from of known causes. What's left is likely due to the remaining factor. Okay, so after accounting for the meat and drinks, only the potato salad remains unexplained and linked to illness. And finally, the method of concomitant uh, variations. If changes in one factor consistently vary with changes in another, they may be causally connected. I like how they say they may be causally connected. Um, so this is what we're going through right now with climate change. We're trying to associate the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere with rise in temperatures. This is what scientists are doing, and some people don't believe that. They get their science from Fox News and the president. So anyway, those are Mill's methods. Was that too brief for you? They're kind of common sense, but they're also very well known. Just so I just bring it up so you'll know that's what they go by. They're attributed to him. And then Laurel had a more sophisticated version. I was going to rely on her to rattle that off today, but I think she went, didn't she travel someplace? You remember? She went someplace, I think. And her and Dan. And then Fred and Alice also are they're oh well, they haven't been here anyway. They quit. uh so that's all I have on Mill's pretty easy to understand, I think. I think his logic is sometimes a little bit sloppy, but we get the picture. It's not rocket science to understand what he's saying. He says it in a lot more words than I did. Uh, and he's not that exciting of a writer, but nevertheless, we'll give him credit where credit is due, especially for the women's stuff. So that's all I got for you today. Um, unless anybody else has some more insightful than I've got things to say.
I'd
Yes,
like,
Meredith.
yeah,
Oh,
go ahead.
Can I say that I have my own set of principles about sentient beings, and the thing that made an example of this to me was that I was driving home from a trip with my car full of friends, and probably going about 80 on I-5, and a mountain lion started to cross the road. And I swerved without even checking if there was a car next to me or right behind me. I swerved just without even thinking about it to avoid that cat. And my friend who was sitting next to me after we all recovered and stopped screaming told me I was an idiot. Why would I swerve in order to not hit a cat? It was a cat. I had to keep going straight because if I had swerved into the next lane and there'd been a car there, it would have had a terrific accident. And it probably would have very seriously damaged, if not killed, people in both cars. And I just never even thought about it. I never even thought about it. So what does that mean about me?
I said the same thing about if you see somebody, my example was an older person who dropped their glasses in a grocery line, but the same thing is true of this happens all the time. People see somebody in distress in the water, they're drowning. They jump in the water without thinking about it for a second, or whatever it is. And we see animals do this too. We don't just see people do it. So I think it's pretty instinctual. This was my argument against Hobbes saying that all of our instincts are just selfish. And what you're talking about, by the way, self-driving cars would be fast enough to respond in a way, even if there was a car next to you, the response they would make would be safer than what you did. Not that you were, you were fine, but they have 8 eyes and they have, you know, microsecond responses. They have responses that are faster than yours. They can make a decision that quickly and respond. That's one of the arguments for self-driving cars.
I
That they're
sincerely doubt that a self-driving car would be able to perceive whether or not that animal was about to get into my lane.
no, they have
Because I
test.
don't think they have, they may have 20 eyes and they still may not be able to understand the intention of a being that is neither a car nor a person.
They're pretty good.
Mm.
They have these tests. That exact test they run. The things they're running into now are backing up, getting in a cul-de-sac or something, and weird situations. But that kind of thing, I think they're pretty reliably better than human response because they're just
Well,
faster.
So, Meredith, I'd say that in that case that you had been paying attention to the traffic around you prior to this event, and that you were at least partially aware that there was no car in the vicinity when you reacted.
It might be true. That might
Yeah,
be true.
that's probably
Right.
true.
Right. But this is sort of like the trolley problem. I mean,
Yeah,
the
I
trolley
was
problem.
thinking that too.
Yeah, well, because partly the trolley problem kind of intellectually is Sophie's choice, right? You're gonna and you're gonna do you're just gonna react because it doesn't matter whether it's 10 people on one side, one side, the other. You know it's going to be terrible. Internally, it's going to be bad. There's no good answer to that, and you're just going to do whatever you're going to do, right? Or you're going to because intellectually, oh, okay, I got 10 people this way, it's like it's Meredith's cat. You're going to respond and you're going to do what you do.
Yeah, Peter, uh, can't hear you. Unmute yourself.
I did.
Oh, there we go.
Okay. I think the trolley problem is different from Sophie's choice. The trolley problem is very artificial, but I would say that it's a case where I would probably agree with the utilitarian judgment. You're going to kill somebody, whatever you do, it's better to kill one person than 10. But Sophie's choice is different because you've got an interaction between two people. It doesn't involve a machine. And the question is whether you morally have the right to choose one of your children over the other. And Talmudic ethics would say, given an example which is somewhat like Sophie's choice, you don't have the right to choose. If they say choose which one shall die, you say, no, I'm not playing your game. And the Talmudic justification for this, I think, is wonderful. How do you know that your blood is redder than theirs, or that the blood of one of them is redder than the blood of another one? So it seems to me they're both artificial. The trolley problem is highly unlikely, but I would say it has a pretty clear answer. And in Sophie's choice, it's also somewhat artificial, but I would say the complete answer is I'm not going to collaborate. And I'm not sure I can justify that. I basically see ethics as instinctive, but I noticed in rereading a tiny bit of Mill before this class that he says quite reasonably, even the people who have an intuitionist view of ethics basically do think there's a principle behind it. They just think it's perceived by intuition rather than reason. So they have to justify what the principle is also. And that's a good point. You can't get out of ethical dilemmas by saying you've got an intuitionist view of them.
I think in Sophie's Choice, it's been a long time since I read it, but I have a feeling that they said if you don't choose one to live, we'll kill them both.
But
Is
even
that not what?
I mean, that's why the I'm not playing your game is sort of nonsense in that category. You might be able to say that. I don't buy that.
it recognizes that you're in their power, but it also recognizes that you're not going to collaborate with that power, even if it means death. I'm not saying it's an easy thing to say, but you know, the Talmudic example is a besieged town, and they say, "Send us out 5 people or 10 people, and we'll leave you alone." And the Talmudic answer is, "You don't have the right to do that to those 5 or 10 people." That seems pretty reasonable to me, although I'm not saying I know what I do in such a case or that it's easy to do it. But it does seem to me the ethical principle is different. Whereas with the trolley, you can't opt out of, you know, that choice because the trolley is going to go one way or the other.
But in the trolley problem, now you're saying, well, I'll just sit there. I'm
If
Blow the
I'm not going to
horn.
decide. I'm not going to
I'm saying
decide.
you
I'm going to
can't,
sit there.
you're not collaborating with an evil-willed person in the trolley problem. It's a kind of mechanical choice. I don't think the greatest good of the greatest number is a very useful ethical principle at all, but I think it does enter into consideration, and the trolley problem is a kind of pure artificial example of when for almost anyone it would enter into consideration. You
The
know,
pro-
unless
I
you
was
say, like, I know the one person who's going to be killed and he's worth more than the other 10.
right.
That's the Nietzschean answer.
Um, the I'm just struck. I'm still stuck on Neil's point. That is a very interesting point. That the instinct we have to act immediately and then probably cover our tracks later by coming up with one or another philosophical argument to support what we did. I wonder if that's not more common in real life than plan because
Oh, yeah.
moral issues pop up out of nowhere.
It's just
So
self-preservation.
yeah, self-preservation or the preservation of another critter that you don't even think about it. This just happened in Texas,
And
people
mental self-preservation. People
mental.
people do that all the time to protect themselves mentally. They justify rationalized behavior. Pretty common, right?
Well, yeah, that's what we're doing in this entire philosophy class. Figuring out ways to rationalize our stupid behavior. No, the instantaneous that getting back to that just instinct to do the right thing that we all have sometimes, that without any kind of it's a reflexive thing. That's a very interesting aspect of our uh, makeup, our intellectual makeup. Just and then to worry about justifying it later. Anyway, ethics is kind of a frustrating topic. When I teach it, I tell people not to not to expect that once you get out of this class, you're going to have rules for proper behavior that you can take with you the rest of your life. Because unfortunately, what we do in ethics is often expose the weaknesses of all the ethical theories that people have brought up. This is not what I'm saying is not me being a nihilist or anything. This is something that most philosophers have come to realize after all these centuries of thinking about it, especially the 1,000 years of the church dominating ethical thinking. After that, when the Enlightenment came, there was also, I think, a relatively naive idea that just rationality would secure a happy future for us. It's been a double-edged sword for sure. But anyway, so it's a little bit frustrating teaching ethics, but we at least what the playing field is. You know what considerations have been examined by philosophers in the past. At least we know that. I feel more comfortable with epistemological questions myself, which I can analyze um, better. Barry,
It just occurs to me that in the field of ethics, it seems like there are some sort of obvious ethical principles that apply to a majority of situations where there is time to actually weigh the options. And then there are some situations that are just ambiguous and difficult to parse because the motivations are not clear. And I think that that's where law comes in, that laws and try to begin to recognize some of those nuances. I mean, why do we have first degree or second degree murder or manslaughter or other distinctions that are refinements of the idea of thou shalt not kill? So I think, that makes sense to me, that as a society, you encounter these situations that require some kind of legalistic and then again, why do we have a trial by jury as the ultimate decision maker in these things? Because we believe that there's some moral code or principles that the jury members might have that would bring some increased justice to the table as well, or fairness. So it just seems like, I don't know, I don't know if that, that just seems like there's a kind of a difference between you want to have some overarching principles. We all could probably agree on them. And then there's always going to be situations like the trolley problem or the proximity problem, or, the guy that on the subway train who tried to subdue a guy who was hassling people and ends up killing him. How do you deal with that? So
The jury system that you brought up and is kind of evidence that we don't have this sorted out. That's why we have to have juries, because even if you get somebody who's a judge and very, very educated in the law, we don't trust him to make the decision either. And we know that juries make mistakes. So it's all the whole jury system is kind of an admission that we don't have a black and white, up and down answer for every situation. We just have to do the best we can. Am I wrong about that? Seems
I
to be.
think that
Oh,
I think that
McEntee
what
was here. McEntee was here for a second. He's a criminal lawyer, but he left. He didn't even weigh in. He showed up and he thought, oh, these people, yuck, and he left. Doug Dennis.
Yeah, Julia Downs.
Julia Dennis. I have to correct that, by the way, in every AI report. Same with Peter. Every one I have to go through and say, because it's Ann that talked, but I have to think, was it Ann or Peter that said that? But in your case, Doug, it's not a problem because Julia's not ever here. Anyway, I'm sorry, I interrupted. Go ahead.
It seems like a lot of this comes back to this idea that you can't know the future. The idea of omniscience, I mean, the one person could be, Beethoven, and the 10 people could be, sex abusers, or that kind of argument. That a lot of laws, a lot of things you don't know. Would it have been okay to have assassinated Hitler? Would that have been
Well, Bonhoeffer thought it would be.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like this concept I can't.
Well, I think another aspect of the jury system that we have is that I think there's an implicit idea that it's better to allow somebody guilty to go free than it is to convict an innocent person. And so it again is a sort of a recognition of the imperfection of the legal structure, and a sort of a societal judgment that we make about, better to not to fail to convict a guilty person than to execute or convict an innocent person.
Well, yeah, Barry, you're right. That is one of the foundational principles of using juries, is that a group of people talking back and forth about how to decide a difficult question like someone's guilt or innocence does better than a single judge does, just about always. Now, then we have, of course, we have those instances where the lawyers appearing have have been too manipulative, um, or there's some other external.
Wait a minute, lawyers being manipulative? What are you talking about?
Are you talking about OJ here?
Yeah, I'm talking about OJ. But I just wanted to say that the idea of a jury, even the jury of the whole, is better than one person making certain kinds of decisions about how things should go.
Who knows
And
who? I'm sorry.
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, who knows the history of the jury system? I mean, I bet it's pretty ancient. In other words, I bet a tribal council, and Native Americans probably decided things like this.
I
Uh,
think it's very different in different societies, though, because many societies leave all the hairy questions up to the leader.
Judge.
Um, not everybody has anything like a jury system. In
oh yeah,
fact,
that's true.
there are
That's
no
true.
juries in Germany right now, as far as I
Is
know.
that right?
Well, I'm not 100% sure, but there are places where they've decided that juries are not worth the candle to put them together.
Well,
Yeah.
there's a couple of one is that at some point in most activities, you need somebody has to decide, right? But the counterbalance and why juries are more valuable is that my wife would have told me this over and over again. Judges are no better than anybody else and tell who's lying. They're just any test of everybody is like it's like almost 50-50. So, but what it does do is, and whether a single judge can make that decision, but if you force 12 people to all agree as to what the credibility of the different witnesses are, makes it more clear. They're more willing to accept that view than a single person. But
Yeah.
you're right. And you can still lead. I've been on juries where it's like, are you really deciding this? You know, and then it's not easy to be the holdout.
Well, the thing about a jury system, though, too, is it takes a unanimous verdict to convict, and it only takes one person to acquit. So
Not a quit. You
Well,
have a hung jury.
But Barry, that's what we have, but that isn't always the case
I know, but
everywhere.
I'm saying I think it's a wise structure, and not because we necessarily know that the jury will be correct more than the judge would have been, because we don't know who's correct. Because we don't know, this goes back to Doug's point. We don't know ultimately what the true guilt or innocence is. So it's a judgment call, but by spreading that judgment over a number of people and by biasing it toward you have to be unanimous to convict, that's a social value that you're putting on this decision. You're saying that's where you're biasing it more toward. I'd rather see an innocent person a guilty person go free than an innocent person be convicted. So you've made a choice by that structure of decision making.
So Peter has had his hand up for a long time.
Yeah, this is a Justice Hugo Black anecdote from Clay County, Alabama, and I think it's basically about the wisdom of juries, at least sometimes. A poor man is accused of stealing a mule from the richest and meanest man in Clay County, and the judge instructs the jury to reach a verdict. The jury comes back almost immediately. Have you reached a verdict? The foreman says, yes, we have. We find the defendant not guilty, providing he returns the mule. And the judge says, you can't do that. You have to either find him guilty or not guilty. Now go back there and return
Wow.
with a verdict. So they consult again briefly, and they come back. Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, we have. Not guilty, and he can keep the mule.
That's a good story. Well, look, guys, as always, a great pleasure. What we're going to do going forward is we're in the 19th century now with Mill, but for the remainder of the classes, what we're going to do is Hegel next, and then Marx, and then Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. So they're all a result, really, of Kant, because what Kant said was the mind isn't a passive recipient of data; it is a creative. Uh, I use the term operating system. It's a creative element in perception. It's not just a passive one. And so what happens going forward is that Hegel says, well, okay, can it change through time? This is the first time this idea has been introduced in Western philosophy. Can the perceiving entity, the brain, the mind, the soul, can it not be the same thing? I think all the philosophers before hadn't really considered this. They said, well, the mind is this, and the world is that, and we're going to try to figure out what the relationship is. But Hegel says, well, the mind isn't necessarily static, it can go through changes. So that's Hegel's idea, and it couldn't have happened without Kant. And then uh, forward from that, we're going to talk about Marx, who had also a dialectic idea, but the dialectic was driven by material things like Hobbes rather than spiritual things like Hegel or intellectual things. And then the existentialists, and all bets are off. So that's the plan going forward. I might talk about Wittgenstein after we do all that. Usually I don't, and the reason is that I think he's very important. However, he won't seem important unless the rest of the questions that we've raised during the term have kind of gelled with you and you can see the problems. If they all seem superficial and silly to you, and they certainly could, then I don't think Wittgenstein will make a dent. I don't think Wittgenstein will seem very important to you. So we'll have to talk about whether we're going to go ahead with him. But anyway, the next thing will be Hegel on Thursday, and in the 19th century, which is a big pot of stuff. So that's that. All right, folks. Let's see. Let's do Wittgenstein. I get from Douglas R. That's a vote for Wittgenstein. All right, guys. We will see you on Thursday.